This is a true story. How do I know? I lived it. My own starry-eyed quest for the American dream. A showbiz odyssey about the famous, the infamous, and the popular culture of the past 50 years. Come join me. Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Rosenthal, and I'm here to tell you some fascinating stories about showbiz that I think you'll find pretty interesting. You see, for nearly 20 years back in the day when there were real movie stars, I turned myself inside out and sideways to solve legal, business, and personal problems for some of the most famous people on earth. Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Rex Harrison, Helen Hayes, Henry Fonda, and for a dozen, believe you me, action-packed years, Jane Fonda, along with a boatload of other celebrated names and faces. I've spent the past few years here at my home in Mexico writing a memoir. It's called Other People's Problems, One Man's Starry-Eyed Quest for the American Dream, a showbiz odyssey. And it's actually about a whole lot more than just showbiz. Money, politics, romance, deceit, betrayal, life and death. Not to mention food, finance, art, economics, and the cosmos. A veritable time machine back into the popular culture of the day. I'm going to share those stories with you, so if you like what you hear, please subscribe and ring that bell so you will know when I'm up with the next installment. Ready? Okay, let's roll 'em. Other People's Problems. Chapter 1. Upheaval. The school teacher's son of a wealthy Beverly Hills auto dealer had wheedled his way into my biggest movie star client's good graces, as many were always trying to do. With little experience in the biz and a cynical, I thought, disingenuous devotion to her vehemently radical 70s politics, he'd somehow convinced her to allow him to become a partner in a film production company I'd formed for her years earlier. Lounging on the blue and white striped sofa in my Upper West Side New York City living room, the 28-year-old told me he wanted to be a full partner, with 50% of the company's ownership and profits. I couldn't help myself. I laughed out loud. What on earth made him think it was fair or reasonable, let alone honorable, for a novice like him to reap benefits equal to my Oscar-winning superstar client, whose name and presence was what counted, and without whom there'd be no company at all? Was anyone else going to offer him a deal like that? Not a chance. Alas, I'd eventually discover it was definitely not what he wanted to hear. Over the next few years, he would team up with a bunch of heavy-duty Hollywood barracudas. They set their sights on deep-sixing me, commandeering my movie star client, all of her business and more, cut and print. It would take a while, but I was penciled in to become chum in the waters of a Hollywood system I discovered to be far more venal and vicious than I had ever imagined. When I politely suggested to the aspiring producer that he was overreaching, I was only trying to protect my client, as I had countless times over the prior decade, confronted with the unrelenting cavalcade of overreachers and threats of all kinds to her professional standing, financial security, personal safety, and general well-being, and that of her family and friends. I was her lawyer, business manager, all-purpose problem solver, and after a dozen action-packed, unimaginably tense and danger-filled years, I thought, her good friend. Worse than a divorce. So here I am a couple of years later on a brilliant May morning, the sun streaming into my sixth-floor Wilshire Boulevard offices with a panoramic view of the Santa Monica Mountains. Sitting across the desk from my movie star, it's clear she's been crying, her eyes red and puffy as she takes a deep breath, looks up at me under darkly mournful lashes, and says, This is worse than a divorce. Richard, I don't want you to represent me anymore. Yow! My heart flew up into my throat. My breath caught fast in my chest. What? What do you mean? I blurted. Why? After all these years, all we've been through together? You know I've done right by you. As I certainly had. Indeed, for most of the prior dozen years, from my home base in New York, I'd taken prime responsibility for the full range of Jane Fonda's legal, business, and financial affairs, and literally thousands of related and unrelated subjects, people, and matters, personal, professional, and by no means least political. I didn't just draw up and read contracts. For Jane and dozens of other showbiz clients, my staff and I performed in areas far beyond those traditionally associated with lawyers. I shared Jane's passionate idealism and did all I could to honor and support it.
Our responsibility as Americans is to concern ourselves with what our country is doing. Daniel Ellsberg said recently, "We're not fighting on the wrong side, we are the wrong side."
At the height of her unpopularity, when we walked into a crowded room together, I had the perverse thrill of putting my body in front of hers, ready or not, in my fantasy mind, to take that bullet. Thankfully, it never came, but it well might have, considering the venomous level of hatred against her. In retrospect, I must have been totally out of my mind, but it didn't seem that way at the time. Jane Fonda had become the center of my professional career and a dominating presence in my life. Over the years, I'd looked at many other famous people, but no one like Jane, feeling the need to have me near. As I sat there over the next 3 anguished hours, going back and forth, trying to reason with her, and of course get myself unfired, I kept thinking of that sunny Saturday in August, 3 years earlier, when the mail brought a life-changing letter. Dear Richard, Tom and I have had some serious talks. Uh-oh. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. I knew this was not just another casual effort to cajole me to move to California. I am really feeling the need, to sum up, to have you near. It seems hard to envision this continent-wide separation. The move would be a positive one for you as well as Teddy, my then wife, and the girls. I am loath to think of alternatives. I feel close to you on a personal level. There is trust, the time already spent together, and many other things. So I'm hoping that you will take my letter seriously. As seriously as a heart attack. I knew I could no longer ignore years of Tom Hayden's provocative asides to Jane while I'm in the car with them. Like, you're a big fucking movie star. How can you have a lawyer who lives in New York? Tom Hayden wanted to run for public office, and he meant business. He knew I advised political campaigns and was conversant with politicians, consultants, fundraisers, and contributors. Just a year earlier, we'd stood together in Madison Square Garden on the floor of the 1976 Democratic National Convention when a frail former Vice President Hubert Humphrey made his way over, stuck a hand out to Tom and said, "I sure wish I'd listened to you when I had the chance, Tom," referencing his not taking an anti-war stance in his ill-fated 1968 presidential candidacy. Tom wanted me and my political savvy there, on the ground in LA, so I could aid his political efforts, hands-on, daily. Well, it was time for the agonizing decision I had long hoped to avoid. Was I ready to abandon what was arguably an ideal existence in New York, uproot my beautiful wife, Teddy, and 2 preteen daughters, Melissa and Alicia, from lives and friends they loved, leave behind a long line of shocked and disappointed New York-based clients, a wonderful, rambling, high-ceiling, rent-stabilized Manhattan apartment, my newly occupied Park Avenue offices, and a long sought after, just acquired country dream house in Quogue on Long Island. And all for the enormous uncertainties, disruptions, and palpable anxiety a move to La La Land was sure to provoke. 13 years out of law school, with a demanding full-time law and business management practice, could I commit myself to the hideous ordeal of studying for one of the toughest bar exams in the country, knowing full well that failure would not just be ignominious, but very public? During the prior few years, I'd become friendly with Ralph Lauren. When I told him one of my grandfathers had been a master tailor and made suits for the impeccably garbed old-time movie star Adolphe Menjou, his eyes lit up. I was a svelte 39 long in those days and proudly wore a half dozen beautifully tailored suits I bought right off the sample rack at Ralph's Midtown offices. We were both originally from the Bronx, had a lot in common, and hit it off, as did our families. I fantasized that if I stayed in New York, at the risk of losing Jane, maybe my business expertise and obvious interests in and eye for fashion might, if I was lucky, evolve into a business relationship with Ralph. Did I want to be his lawyer in New York or Jane's in LA? By that point, full disclosure, I had also begun to hunger for something more than just continually overloading myself with other people's problems. After working as intensely as I did, and more or less missing my kids' formative years, I wasn't sure how much longer I could do that. They may act like your friend, but since I was a kid, thanks to my profoundly principled father, I bought into the idea that it was ethically preferable and a whole lot easier as a practical matter to tell the truth rather than a lie, which was harder to remember and usually had to be followed up with additional lies. Some would consider it a flaw in my DNA, that lying never came easy or felt right. Too much conscience, not an obvious asset in my chosen profession. Naively, I'd convinced myself to avoid taking on clients I might not enjoy spending time with, or with whom I could also be friends. But in retrospect, I was fooling myself. As one dear client, Ruth Ford, widow of actor Zachary Scott and former heartthrob of Nobel laureate William Faulkner, reminded me, "Just remember, Richard, you're their lawyer. They may act like your friend, but bottom line, you're just the hired help." Regularly mixing business with pleasure, my professional life was almost never boring, but it wasn't particularly fulfilling either, except for rare moments like the 1972 Oscars, when I sat nervously in the front row of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in downtown LA, as my movie star client regally redeemed herself in the eyes of the world, albeit only temporarily, by accepting the Oscar with magical words I had dreamed up for her only a half hour earlier. Years later, to my deep disappointment, she would deny under oath that I had given her those words, bizarrely forgetting that there were witnesses, and that she'd written me in her own patrician handwriting only a few weeks after the Oscars to say, "You're also a good speechwriter. I've had many compliments, even my grandmother. Have you ever considered moving to LA?" Growing up in the 40s and 50s, an only and lonely child with an invalid mother, I'd come to love movies, TV, and showbiz in general. They were my best friends and, aside from sports, my principal source of entertainment. I'd been around long enough to allow me to dream that moving into the creative end of the biz as a writer, producer, would allow me to apply my interests, knowledge, and abilities to far greater personal satisfaction and benefit aesthetically and financially. And the best place to do that was LA. Suffice to say that I acceded to Jane's and Tom's entreaties to transplant and spent the next year making ready. On July 1st, 1978, with a caravan of 7 people, 1 dog, and 25 pieces of luggage, we arrived at our new home on Upper Stone Canyon Road in beautiful Bel Air to find a banner painted by Henry Fonda stretched wide across the garage door. "Welcome to the Big Orange. Love, Henry and Shirley." For the next 2.5 years, I did everything I could think of, everything in my power, to faithfully serve the needs, wants, and whims of the ever-expanding and demanding Fonda Hayden universe. But it hadn't been enough. A little more than a year earlier, I had learned that the aspiring producer was trying to get rid of me in earnest. To placate him, Jane had subjected me and how I'd managed her money and investments over the prior 7 years to a microscopic examination by Morris Stoller, Senior VP, Chief Financial Officer, and board member of her talent agency, the William Morris Office. Stoller was to personally perform the inquisition, which he very politely kicked off by visiting my offices to explain what he wanted. My staff and I spent the next week assembling detailed records and tax returns, and I prepared a comprehensive memorandum of my activities on Jane's behalf, all of which were then delivered to him. After several weeks, a call finally came in one afternoon. "Morris Stoller on line 4, said Mary Rocco, my very smart, clever, funny, highly skilled secretary, personal assistant. After the pleasantries, Stoller said, "Richard, you're not going to like hearing this, but I met with Miss Fonda last week, and she had the aspiring producer along with her. I told her I had very carefully reviewed the records, and it was my considered judgment that she should get down on her knees every day and thank the good Lord she had you there all these years looking after her." He paused a few seconds. "But I'm sorry to have to tell you, she didn't seem very happy to hear that. Something else I'll tell you, Mr. Aspiring Movie Producer is no friend of yours." Stoller's validation and praise had calmed the waters for a while, but evidently no longer. I'm okay for little people. So there I sat with my most revered client and dear friend slumped in her chair, 3 feet across from me, bawling her eyes out, telling me she didn't think me sufficiently positioned to give her the kind of investment advice and direction she now thought she needed. "You're okay for little people like my father," she said. I'd looked after Henry and Shirley Fonda's business and finances for several years. "I need more sophisticated advice with more clout and leverage. You're into other things, you're very creative. It'll probably be the best thing ever happened to you." Was it? In retrospect, the answer is both no and yes. It was a very bitter pill. Led to my suing Jane 5 years later, more to come, and years of anguish for my family and me. But we were resilient, survived to enjoy better days, and are certainly all the wiser for it. At the time, though, it felt like a spear through the center of my chest, like the bottom had fallen out of my tenuously constructed life, which, inside my head, I experienced as a sort of high wire act from which I could at any moment slip and plummet to earth. Alternatively, I saw myself like the circus performer who spins those little plates atop long sticks, adding more and more sticks and plates until the whole shebang crashes to the ground. And now mine had. There's no question I had too much on my plate in those days. Much too much, with Jane and Tom's increasing demands on my time and energies. It didn't help that I also spent much of my life then and for years thereafter afflicted with a persistent sense of impending doom, constantly having to resist the thought that at any second I could be struck dead on the spot. I've since figured out exactly from whence that toxicity came, and will explain later. As I piloted my Fonda-approved, no-frills Ford Fairmont station wagon up Beverly Glen, the horn button dangerously stashed in the directional signal, so you couldn't easily access it if you were making a left turn, Richard Nixon's gift to the auto industry, I wondered how I would break the news to my wife, let alone everyone else. Martin Luther King's booming voice suddenly erupted in my head. Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last! Yup. Gangbanged LA style. At least I didn't have to ask myself twice what went wrong. I'd been gangbanged LA style. A dog-eat-dog world it was then, and probably still is, in the ethical wasteland of Hollywood business dealings, so perfectly captured in Hello, He Lied, and other truths from the Hollywood trenches, Linda Obst's 1997 industry page-turner. I learned the hard way that there was a definite difference in how business was conducted in New York versus LA, where, as someone once observed, they don't just want you to fail, they want you to die. When I first told Teddy about Jane quitting me, true to form, she'd been her loyal, supportive, loving self. Maybe you'll be better off, she said. Maybe we'll all be better off. She well knew the enormous toll the past few years had exacted on all of us. I just needed to think and reflect on what to do next. A luxury I'd never enjoyed throughout my career because always with so much to do and not enough time to do it, reflection time from day to day was almost non-existent. I just had to keep those plates spinning. I also had to remember that all was not lost. Yes, I was somewhat humiliated and plagued with uncertainty, but I hadn't gotten to where I was by being a quitter. In the days prior to my last meeting with Jane, I've been in talks with the then head of ABC Daytime, Bob Iger, future CEO and chairman of Disney, to make my longtime New York client and close friend Gordon Russell, head writer of the Hollywood-based #1 daytime TV drama, General Hospital. Once an actor and ever the showman, Gordon was brilliant, funny, and looked like a modern-day incarnation of Rembrandt. We shared several summer houses in Connecticut and the Hamptons, and many, many fun times over the years. He'd written a passel of popular daytime dramas, The Doctors, A Time for Us, Dark Shadows, before we met, and had been head writer of New York-based One Life to Live for the prior 8 years. Now those talks had resulted in a long-term deal that would pay $1 million a year for the writing package. To my knowledge, the most ever paid to that point, plus expenses and other perks for Gordon's relocation to LA. My commission? $50,000 a year. Not a bad start in trying to repair the income loss from Jane's defection. My LA real estate specialist, Nora Warner, had found Gordon a great house to rent on Tower Road in Beverly Hills. He'd always hankered to live in California and was equally excited. A month after my getting the boot from Jane, Gordon came, saw the house, signed a lease, and was on the plane back to New York when disaster struck. He'd suffered some kind of a seizure and was able to get home on his own, but at the insistence of his girlfriend and soon-to-be wife, Mary, he went to the hospital. At first, we were elated to hear he hadn't suffered a heart attack, but soon after, they found an inoperable mass in his chest. He would be dead in 6 months, rarely having left the hospital. Et tu, Joel? 5 months after my fateful meeting with Jane, I sat in a crowded hamburger hamlet on the western edge of the Sunset Strip with another longtime client and friend, Joel Schumacher, who had introduced me to Ralph Lauren and was just coming into his own after writing screenplays for Car Wash and The Wiz. He would later direct dozens of films, including 2 Batmans and The Phantom of the Opera. After the customary "How's the family?" because we spent plenty of family time together over the years, he took a sip of his Coke, cleared his throat, and said, "I'm very sorry, Richard, but I think I need more sophisticated advice with more clout and leverage. I don't want you to represent me anymore." Holy shit. It was happening again. Within days, I received notice that Joel was signing with the very same law firm and business managers who had poached Jane from me only months earlier. They could have at least given him a slightly different script, but arrogance pays no homage to originality. At least he didn't tell me I was okay for little people. Between Joel, Jane, and Gordon, Richard M. Rosenthal Professional Corporation was in the dumper, about to lose more than half its gross annual income. This was a huge blow, both to my bank account and self-esteem. And news travels fast in Tinseltown. True, I still had a roster of showbiz luminaries who brought in hundreds of thousands in fees, but I also had an overhead to match, with offices and staffs in both New York and LA that would have left me barely breaking even. Since moving to California, I'd round trip between LA and New York about 30 times, spending 7 to 10 days every month in the Big Apple to better serve New York-based clients. What was I supposed to do now? Start looking for new clients? A new superstar to replace Jane? Did I really want to do that? Keep running a nonstop rat race, which especially over the past year had begun to drive me batty. A month earlier, I'd had my 40th birthday, which was, as you might imagine, not a particularly happy one. Teddy and my faithful and supremely capable and poetic bookkeeper, Anita Shapiro, who joyfully moved west with us, had rented me a Bugatti convertible to celebrate the day. Parked in our driveway, it looked like a Saudi prince had taken a wrong turn and stopped to ask directions. I hesitatingly climbed in and took daughter Melissa for a quick early morning spin through the lush, fragrant lanes of Bel Air. But riding around, calling attention to myself in that extremely showy rig was the last thing I wanted to do. A year earlier, I'd bought some snazzy Fred Astaire-style brown and white Oxfords at a Fred Siegel sale and didn't want to be seen in them either. I wanted not to show off, but to hide. On the other hand, I now had a movie development deal at Universal that I didn't need to be full-time in LA to pursue. While Alicia, 11, had come to love living here, Melissa, 15, had never stopped hating the move and was intent on going to college back east at Vassar, ironically the same school Jane had attended without graduating. My spacious West Side apartment, in which I temporarily installed another friend and client, London trichologist Philip Kingsley, was also beckoning. My life for the past 16 years had been almost entirely devoted to hearing, analyzing, and for the most part, solving other people's problems. I'd managed to do so with great success and some satisfaction, but I'd also become sick of it. With all that had just happened, especially Gordon's impending death, it occurred to me that the universe might just be sending me a message. Start focusing on my own problems, on Teddy and the girls, and just close up shop and move us all back to New York. Okay, that's it for now. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and ring that bell so you'll be on tap for Chapter 2. Adios.